Welcome back to another episode of Written for Our Admonition, Studies in the Old Testament, and we're picking up where we left off in our conversation from last week about Moses and his role that he played in Israel. We've already talked about two of those roles, and we're going to be discussing the final one today, that being his role as prophet. But we just want to briefly summarize and review what we've understood up to this point so we can bring this all together neatly and really understand why Moses is such a significant figure in Israel's history and really in the entirety of Scripture. So, of course, we talked first and foremost about how Moses was Israel's deliverer. And we made clear in that discussion that that does not mean that Moses, on his own power or authority, was able to deliver the nation. It was God working through Moses as his representative to bring that to pass. And we saw that Moses, in his personality, very unlikely that he would have done that on his own initiative. But with God's help and with God's encouragement and really God putting this upon him, he was able to bring that to pass and make it happen because God was with him the whole way through. And then we also saw with his role as lawgiver, which was our previous conversation, that Moses was a mediator between God and the people of Israel. And we even discussed the fact that they begged Moses to be in that role and how God was able to use Moses to bring this to pass. And it really culminated in that conversation about Exodus chapter 24, verses 1 through 8, where we see there Moses presiding over the sealing of the covenant between God and the people of Israel, one of the most significant selections that you'll find in the Old Testament because of how important it is to understand the idea of a covenant. And that text does a very good job of showing what that means and why it matters so much. And yet, despite what we've talked about up to this point about Moses, him being deliverer, which you would think would stand out to people who experienced that firsthand and even generations after that, and his role as lawgiver, which again you would think would stand out in a significant way, we find that he's not really remembered for being deliverer or being the lawgiver, although he was those things, and Scripture makes it clear that he played that part. What he's remembered for is his role as prophet. And there's some reasons for that we're going to consider in this discussion, but we need to understand that that is what Moses is most known for. It's what the future looks forward to when it talks about a prophet like Moses, which we'll get to in just a little bit. But why is it that being a prophet was so significant, and how is it that that could summarize the life of a man who has done so much and has accomplished so much for the service of God? It's incredible to think that you could take just one word like prophet and have that really be a summary statement of all that someone has done in his life. But let's consider what the text itself has to say about this. That's going to take us to a place in Deuteronomy chapter 34, verses 10 through 12, written after Moses was dead at this point, so it's likely that Joshua wrote this, but it's significant that Joshua, who was also inspired of God to record some scripture, wrote this section about Moses to tell us something about him and reflect on that memory that the nation had concerning Moses. So without further ado, let's just look at that text together here. I'm looking at Deuteronomy chapter 34, verses 10 through 12. But since then there has not arisen in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, and all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, before Pharaoh, before all his servants, and in all his land, and by all that mighty power and all the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. So right there shows that Moses as a prophet is what stood out the most when people reflected upon him in his life. And the text even gives some reasoning behind this. It talks about how the Lord spoke to him, and how the Lord used him to accomplish these signs and wonders, and how he was able to accomplish this in the land of Egypt, before Pharaoh, before all his servants, and all the mighty power and great terror that Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. But it's his role as prophet that stood out to them the most. Because when you really get down to brass tacks about what being a prophet means, it in many ways summarizes what we've already considered up to this point, and just tacks on a few extra details to help us understand really what's going on. So we understand that him being a prophet was very important. It was very significant. And that is why, as we go back to our slideshow here, we say that Moses in his role as prophet is actually going to establish how God will use prophets going forward. So Moses becomes in some respects a model prophet for what the future holds down the road, not only in the history of Israel, but even as we're going to consider later what's going to come to pass with Jesus. Now we have to take a step back for a moment and really contemplate what a prophet is, or what that word really means. It comes into English from the Greek language, so whenever that happens, the meaning of that word sometimes gets a bit lost in translation, or I should say lost in transliteration in this particular case. So in Moses, when we think about him being a prophet, or just any person being a prophet in the scriptures, we're talking about someone who was called by God for that purpose, and they were called by God to proclaim his message and to validate his will, to ensure that it was understood that what was being preached by this particular person, this prophet, was legitimate, and it was what God wanted communicated to his people at that point in time. And that's where, as we're going to continue our conversation about the Old Testament, we're going to see a whole lot of prophets that are going to emerge in that conversation. Because when you think about the role of prophets in the Old Testament, and specifically in Israel, their history is inseparable from that of the prophets. In many respects, they go together. And that can be a good thing in some cases, and in many cases, unfortunately, it is not a good thing. Not because of the prophets, but because of the reason the prophets had to come up and say and do what they did in the land of Israel and Judah. But going back to Moses here and thinking about his role as prophet and what that meant for him, we're going to consider two specific elements that are relevant to that conversation. And the first element is this, that in his prophetic work, Moses communicated God's message to Israel. Now, we basically already said this in so many words. And we already have seen throughout the law of God given through Moses, from Genesis all the way into Deuteronomy, how many times is it that Moses writes down in the law that whatever the Lord said, he wrote that down and spoke it to the children of Israel. If you look at the book of Leviticus especially, that's the constant refrain of that book. Every single chapter is loaded down with those phrases of the Lord spoke to Moses saying, and then he gave him his law, gave him his commandments, gave him his expectations, whatever the case might have been. Over and over and over again, you see this happening. You see this taking place in the Old Testament scriptures. Wherever God spoke to Moses, Moses communicated that to Israel and let them know what God wanted from them. Now, here's an important point for us to consider, especially when you think about Moses and his role as prophet. It applies to all prophets, but especially when you talk about Moses, it's important to understand this truth. We typically think about prophets as ones who speak about the future exclusively, that they're always talking about something to come to pass down the road. We almost use that word prophet to talk in that way in just general conversation, if we use that word at all. We're going to say, oh, this person pretended to be a prophet, and we're thinking in mind they were talking about the future. And there's some truth to that, of course, because prophets do speak of the future. But we understand that especially in Moses, many of the things that he said did not actually apply to the future per se, but applied to his own time. Now, obviously, when you think about the law of God, that's going to apply in the present. It's also going to apply in the future when you're looking at it from the perspective of the Israelites. So there's a bit of a mixture and overlap there. But that does not change the reality that many of the things Moses said had more to do with the people of his time and the generations that were immediately after them than it did us today per se. Now, I want to be clear about something. That does not mean that we cannot learn the lessons that need to be learned from these passages. That does not mean we cast them out and say they're unimportant. After all, that's why we're studying the Old Testament as a general idea here, because we understand it has value. It has something to contribute positively to our faith. So we're not saying to cast these things out and ignore them, but we're simply making the point that from the perspective of Moses and the people in his own time, some of the things that he spoke and wrote had a lot more relevance to them and their situation than it would to people in subsequent generations. But with that being said, and understanding that the role of a prophet was not always just speaking about God's message for the future, we do need to understand that when the prophets did speak about the future, and this is especially true for Moses, that it was always accurate. They did not make mistakes. They did not misspeak. It's not as though Moses just took a shot in the dark and said, I think this will happen, but I'm not sure about it. That's not the way the prophets of the Old Testament operated, and it's certainly not how Moses operated. If you look at a place like Deuteronomy chapter 27 and 28, which we will not read because they're both lengthy chapters, but I would encourage you to consider that a little bit after you listen to this lesson. But especially in Deuteronomy chapter 28, you could almost take that chapter and map out the history of Israel from beginning to end, from the beginning of where they're entering the promised land and having prosperity and success, all the way down to the captivity in the days of Hezekiah, or in the days of Josiah and his sons and so forth. I mean, if you look at that situation, you see how it unfolds, and you understand that what Moses wrote is exactly what came to pass. And there's so many details that are given there that are specific. It's not as though it's generic. It's not ambiguous. We're not talking about the prophecies of someone like Nostradamus where it could be interpreted in multiple different ways. What Moses said about the future was accurate. It was specific. It spoke of events that did not come to pass for millennia afterward. And that goes to show that what Moses said was God's message, that it was legitimate, that it actually was what God wanted communicated to his people. Now, I do want to point something else out here concerning Moses and his role as prophet, because this makes him a bit more significant than others we might read about in the Old Testament who were prophets. Let's turn our attention to the book of Numbers, and let's specifically go to Numbers chapter 12 and verses 6 through 8. So here's Numbers chapter 12, verses 6 through 8. And we won't dwell too much on the context, but understand that Aaron and Miriam have complained about Moses and his Ethiopian wife. They've spoken against him. And their basic intention is, has the Lord not spoken through us too? And they're kind of elevating themselves and challenging Moses and his authority. And that's why they have this complaint against him and they view him in a negative sense. And that's what leads God here in verses 6 through 8 to confront Aaron and Miriam for their transgression in disobeying Moses and trying to rebel against him. And this is what God says concerning Moses to Aaron and Miriam to help them to understand what God has with Moses is pretty unique. It's very special. It is beyond what was typical. So here's what he says starting in verse 6. Hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision. I speak to him in a dream. Notice this. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. I speak with him face to face, even plainly, and not in dark sayings. And he sees the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? Now again, in the context here, the reason God mentions these details to Aaron and to Miriam is to help them to understand that you do not speak ill of God's prophet. You do not blaspheme him and go against him so lightly and so easily as they had done. It was a significant transgression on their part to try to challenge his authority and to overthrow him and to put themselves on his level when God had not put them in that position. He had not allowed that to come to pass. Because as he points out here in verses 6 through 8, his relationship with Moses and the way he communicated with Moses was different than he had ever done with any man. He says very plainly in verse 8, when he speaks with Moses, it's face to face. And by that, he doesn't mean literally face to face, but he just means that that's the way they spoke with one another, that it was a conversation, it was a discussion, it was something plain, something that was obvious. It was not something hidden in parables or psalms or anything like this. It was plain and clear. And then Moses was able then to communicate that on to the children of Israel. So Moses is God's prophet, yes. He communicates God's will to Israel, and that relationship actually went even deeper than you're going to see with prophets down the road. Because what Moses has with God is fundamentally unique and special, and something that goes beyond what we typically see later on with other prophets as well, even prophets like Elijah and Elisha, where the same thing that's said of Moses is not said of them, despite the fact that they were most certainly performing a similar role. So all that being said about Moses and his role as a prophet, I think we understand the fact that that clearly means that he was someone who spoke God's will, communicated God's message. But that's not all it meant for him to be a prophet in Israel. There's still another part of this that we have to consider. And that part is the reality that Moses performed signs and wonders by God's power and thus showed that he was indeed God's messenger. And that's really what the purpose of miracles is in the Bible as a whole, not just the New Testament, but also the Old Testament. The reason these signs and wonders were performed was to confirm that whatever was being communicated really reflected God's will. It was to show the people that this message was legitimate. It was to show these people that what God was communicating was to be taken seriously and to listen to that prophet who is communicating it and to take that word as authoritative. So go back to the book of Exodus. Think about those early chapters through about chapter 15. And you're thinking about how Moses confronts Pharaoh. And what does he do each time he confronts the Pharaoh? He doesn't just say, take my word for it. He obviously communicates God's will to Pharaoh and lets him know what God expects in that situation, but it's always accompanied by some type of miracle. The 10 plagues are those miracles that are performed to show to Pharaoh and to the land of Egypt that God was not playing games, that he was to be taken seriously, and that what Moses said was legitimate, and that they ought to pay heed to that and to listen to what he said, lest more terror come upon them. We know how that ended. We know they did not listen, they did not take it seriously, and the full power and brunt of what God was able to bring upon that nation came to pass because of their own hard-headedness and their hard-heartedness and not listening to what God was plainly communicating, and not only communicating but confirming through the hand of Moses. And so repeatedly, even after the Exodus from Egypt, after that situation unfolds, they're in the wilderness, they're at Mount Sinai, they're on the border of the Promised Land, over and over and over again, you're seeing Moses carry out these miraculous deeds that are the proof that he really was a legitimate prophet. And you would think they would have taken that seriously, but unfortunately they did not. I've already talked about Numbers 12, where you see Moses' siblings, his sister and his brother, complaining about his role as prophet and wanting to challenge his authority and to see him as less than he was. That was not an isolated incident. It happens later in another situation in Numbers chapter 16, when you're talking there about Korah and his company, who come up and they also challenge Moses and his authority and think that he really was not who he claimed to be. They themselves wanted to have leadership in Israel, and they thought they could take it on their own terms. That was not how it really was, but that's the way they thought about it. I want to just read from what Moses says in that situation, without going into all the details about Korah and his company and what they did and all this, but let's just focus on what Moses says in this particular section, because I believe it really clues us in on what it means for a prophet to do these signs and wonders and what it actually says about who they are and what they're trying to accomplish. So with that being said, Here we are in Numbers chapter 16, reading what Moses says to Korah and his company in verses 28 through 33. And Moses said, "By this you shall know that the Lord has sent me to do all these works, for I have not done them of my own will. If these men die naturally like all men, or if they are visited by the common fate of all men, then the Lord has not sent me." Let's pause right there. What is Moses saying here about his role as prophet? What is he saying about the Lord sending him? He's saying that there's about to be something that happens that shows you that I really have been sent by God. And he's saying here in verse 29 specifically that if these people, talking about Korah and his company, if they die naturally like everybody else does, they go the way of all the earth, that means the Lord has not sent Moses, that he is not legitimate. And so Moses in this way is actually issuing a challenge. He's actually saying here that if I'm not legit, you're going to see it pretty clearly here and it's going to be obvious. So let's go on in verse 30. "But if the Lord creates a new thing, and the earth opens its mouth and swallows them up with all that belongs to them, and they go down alive into the pit, then you will understand that these men have rejected the Lord. Now it came to pass, as he finished speaking all these words, that the ground split apart under them, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up, with their households and all the men of Korah, with all their goods. So they and all those with them went down alive into the pit. The earth closed over them, and they perished from among the assembly." Was Moses a legitimate prophet? There should be no question, because he said this would happen before it actually took place. And it was a sign and a wonder and a terror in this particular situation that proved that Moses really was legitimate and he spoke on God's behalf, that he was his messenger. As tragic as this was and as non-ideal as it was that proof Israel needed to understand that Moses was to be taken seriously, that God expected Israel to heed him and to listen to him because he was his chosen vessel, his chosen representative. So having said all of those things, we understand that because Moses was a prophet, he performed these signs and wonders that confirmed his role and that showed God's power. And again, to make it clear as we possibly can, it's not as though Moses could have communicated God's will apart from God communicating it to him, nor could he have done these signs and wonders by his own power. In fact, he mentions in that text we just read in Numbers chapter 16 quite plainly, he has not done them of his own will, because frankly, he could not have done them of his own will, nor could any person. It can only be done if God empowers that person to carry these things out. And so to bring all this together and to summarize it, we see that Moses is remembered indeed first and foremost as a prophet. And that is because what he did throughout his life, of all the varied things that he accomplished, can be summarized in that role. It is the most significant thing that he did. He was God's spokesperson. He was his representative. He was his mediator, and all that is bound up in what it means for him to be a prophet. Now, Moses is not the only person in the Old Testament that's described as a prophet. We already know that before we came into the study, undoubtedly. We know that in the Old Testament, you've got possibly thousands of prophets that are going to come and go in Israel's history. We have only a portion of what they wrote, because again, if you look at the text of places like 1st and 2nd Kings, I mean, you've got a ton of prophets that come and go. Not all of them wrote down what they said because it wasn't necessary, but we have quite a few of them who did. But nevertheless, there were a lot of prophets, and Moses, though, is the beginning of that. He is the first one who is going to be in Israel, in the nation, acting in that role as prophet. But those that come after him are going to be, in some respect, in his likeness. Although in the Old Testament, you're never going to find a prophet who quite meets that expectation. There's not going to be one singular prophet in the Old Testament who really comes on the scene just like Moses did. And that's precisely why there's the expectation of a specific prophet who would come in the likeness of Moses later down the road. And that brings us to Deuteronomy chapter 18 and verses 15 through 19, which will help us to bring our lesson to a conclusion and to see how this all connects together into the rest of Scripture. So join me in the reading here of Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 15 through 19, as we draw to a close. "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your midst, from your brethren. Him you shall hear, according to all you desired of the Lord your God in Horeb in the day of the assembly, saying, Let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God, nor let me see this great fire any more, lest I die. And the Lord said to me, What they have spoken is good. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brethren, and will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. And it shall be that whoever will not hear my words, which he speaks in my name, I will require it of him." There's an expectation by Moses' own writing that there will be a future prophet. And notice the details that are spoken there in verses 18 through 19. "I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brethren," specifying the origin of this future prophet. "I will put my words in his mouth. He will be a messenger. He shall speak to them all that I command him," communicating God's will to the people. And notice this in verse 19. Whoever will not hear my words which he speaks in my name, I will require of him. A prophet like Moses, a prophet coming on the scene, doing similar things to Moses, and even exceeding Moses in all that he was able to do. So Moses was not only a model for the Old Testament prophets in general, for people who would come later like Elijah and Elisha and Isaiah and so on and so forth, but he's looking forward to a prophet down the road who is even more significant than Moses himself was. And of course, from a Christian perspective in the New Testament, we know exactly who that is. We're talking about Jesus Christ. In fact, the Apostle Peter connects Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 15 through 19, back to Jesus in Acts chapter 3. So we see that connection very clearly. We see how Moses is a figure, as it were, of what Christ would do, and how Christ would actually exceed all that Moses did. But coming back to him for just a moment to bring all these things to a conclusion and summarize all the points we've made, just look at what God was able to do through Moses. Look at what he was able to accomplish, how he was able to empower Moses, who was not the person you would expect, to do the things that he did. That just goes to show the great power of God. And it goes to show his wisdom in choosing people to serve him in these special ways. Moses was not a man who was necessarily fit to be a leader, certainly not fit to be a deliverer, certainly not fit to be a lawgiver nor a prophet. And yet God, through his great power, and through the cooperation of Moses, to be fair to him, was able to bring these things to pass. We're grateful for his example. We learn much from it. And we understand the role that he played in Israel and how important he's going to be not only in his own time, but even later, because we're going to continue to see the echoes of Moses and his results and his success, and sometimes his failures, that are going to echo throughout the rest of Israel's history, leading us then into the New Testament. I hope these lessons have benefited you in some way, that have brought your attention to Moses in ways that you may not have thought about before, and I would invite you to consider these things in further detail as we've gone through this lesson, and to join us again next week as we continue on in this series about the Old Testament, turning our attention now to the entry into the Promised Land that's told to us in the book of Joshua. Thank you for your attention today, and I hope you have a wonderful time. Thank you.